What more would you like to see? You've spoken of some of the problems and challenges.
Yeah.
If you were advising Prime Minister Modi and his government at this moment, looking as you do from inside and from outside, what specifically would you like to see change?
Yeah, so I think again, I'm talking about the execution piece. I just think there needs to be a lot more partnership between the central government and state governments. And I just think that, again, I'm not privy to all the political ramifications of things, but the fact is that that's one. So it's actually really partnering up with the governments because that's where the execution is happening. Two is that I think, again, we are making good progress, but I do think that this, ultimately, when you want to create those 10 million jobs, which is what's actually going to drive this economy and why people are investing, you've got to create more opportunities on vocational training, things like that, which actually, employ people at scale. So the supply of good labor is a problem. And the third thing, which is, it's very hard to see from a pure visible standpoint, India is very uncompetitive from a cost of infrastructure and public goods standpoint. So to actually just operate, so if someone had exactly the same factory in Vietnam or China and here, the actual cost of operations is about 15 to 20% higher because the infrastructure costs, all kinds of different costs. So I think there are incentives which are trying to bring that down, but that's the other thing. I mean, you cannot be competitive globally if your cost structure is 20% higher. I mean, a lot of business people sitting here, I mean, it just won't happen. I think the other thing is that while the local, the market here is a big market, so a lot of investment happens for this market, this is an opportunity for India to be manufacturing for the world in addition to manufacturing for the country. And I think that too, 5 years ago, we were always talking about domestic market, let's manufacture more, let's be more, self-reliant, like the Prime Minister's big initiatives. But we should be manufacturing for the world here. And again, we have a unique opportunity given the rifts that are going on between the geopolitical problems between China and the US, that you actually have a big opportunity where you could be diversifying a lot for global multinationals and global operations in Europe and the US.
You were in Hong Kong recently when that big Communist Party meeting happened in Beijing. I'm curious to know your thoughts on where the China story goes from here economically. As far as militaries are concerned, India has a build-up with China along the line of actual control, and that's a big headache. And many would like to know whether, because there's a lot of conspiracy theories around how a lot of the Chinese data is fake, the real estate debt is piling up, there's a big bubble, and that the Chinese economy at some point in time could either flatten or possibly even start coming down. The flip to that is that the growth of China is irreversible, all of you are delusional and living in la la land, and China will sooner than later beat the United States and rule the world.
So again, there are lots of pundits, and as I said, I was in Hong Kong last week, only place where you still need to wear a mask, you got to test every day, you got to do all kinds of things, which is like, anyway, whatever. But I think that we'll have more clarity on that in December and March. The key issue is that President Xi now, based on all the people I met and spoke with, both in the mainland as well as in Hong Kong, is that he's now in full control, because otherwise people in even that group of 7 people, there were people who were from another side. I mean, I don't know whether you saw this TV where Hu Jintao, who was the previous president, was physically just walked out of the Communist Party event, and publicized around the world, which is like a complete shocker if people were surprised. But it was a show of power. That's the interpretation. And so there's the thing that now everyone is in complete control. That what happens next? Is this going to be back to kind of quasi-Mao days, or is it going to be? My belief is, and based on again, people like over here, when a politician, like you had Prime Minister, you had Mr. Thackeray here and others, they pass their words, etc., etc. In China, it's a whole new level. There's a whole industry which sits and analyzes speeches. How many words were security? How many words were development? How many words were economics? What does that mean? Blah, blah, blah. I do think that while you'll see a lot more focused on Taiwan, security, etc., like you were saying, that they recognize that business and government, economy, etc., is absolutely important and critical. It's not something you can just kind of flush down the toilet in the name of communism. So I believe that they'll be back on track. And the person who's the number 2 guy, people, just so you know, he was the one who was part of a province that really grew Alibaba, and Jack Ma really encouraged it. He's the one who was now, as the head of Shanghai, brought in Tesla at scale. I mean, the second largest manufacturing of Tesla is in China. He was responsible for that, and he's the number 2 person. And so I think that this thing, oh, China's finished and all that is just not true. I think the growth rates will be lower, but that's because it's a smaller base. You know, India's growing at 8% on a $2.5 trillion base. China's going at 2.5, 3% on a $14.5, $15 trillion base. I mean, you know, so they're actually creating more GDP per year, even though our growth rate is higher. So it's not, I think I'm still quite optimistic that from a business standpoint that China is still very much there. But given what's happened, I think investors will be quite skittish. And so therefore, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years, I think India will be a huge beneficiary of that.